Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought. All right, so today I want to give a little preview and offer some tidbits that didn't make it into my book review of Trent Horn and Catherine Pakaluk's book, Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? And I did an episode before about kind of what to expect with this book when I kind of responded to Trent Horn's podcast about the book. So I'll link that in the show notes. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll need to go over to Anchor. The link in the description on YouTube will lead you to the show notes on Anchor. So if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, first of all, thank you very much, because I have ads running on these on the podcasts. If you're on YouTube and you don't have me on your if you're a podcast person and you don't have me on your podcast app, please search out Trad Dads on there and see if you can get that for automatic download. Okay, so enough self-promotion. But so what I want to do is, whenever you write a book review, you only have so much space, and you have to make decisions about what you're going to actually say and what you're going to leave out. And so, I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of give some more discussion and maybe just give a little preview of what's in this. I'm hoping this will be coming out in the next week or so. Whenever you write, you inevitably get rejected by, outlets. It's just the way the academic and the publishing world works. But so I have not yet got it published, but I'm hoping that this, the one that I just sent it to, I'm hoping that they will take it. So if not, I've got kind of I've got other options, so we'll see. So what I find so interesting about this book is that, number one, we're seeing all these groups jump into this discussion about what does Catholic social teaching mean for economic policy. And just today I saw, and I put up a post about this on the Leonine Institute page, social media pages, so you can check that out. But let's see, is it Merrill Lynch? Anyway, one of the big banks, put out, it's Morgan Stanley, there we go. One of the big banks put out a Catholic Values Primer, a tool used for institutions and individuals to align faith and finance. Please. That sounds really bad. I mean, obviously I need to, take a look at it before I really criticize it, but, a giant bank telling me what the Catholic Church thinks about investing, I don't think I'm interested. But Horn's book was published through Catholic Answers, which is normally just a, Catholic apologetics outlet, right? What would they be doing with economics? It's such a weird, even Catholic social teaching, right? There's all kinds of Catholic teaching that they don't get into, right? It's mostly apologetics. Why would they be diving into this? So I think there's an opportunity for the Leonine Institute. And by the way, if you haven't heard of that, that is an effort that I'm spearheading with a couple of friends to try to provide some education on Catholic social teaching and what it means for the world today, and how we can apply it today. And I think the difference between us and other people is that we are trying to be faithful to the Church's teaching. We are trying to put that first, and not to try to squeeze the Church's teaching into whatever preconceived political views we already have, which I think is sadly very common with these other groups. So anyway, to get to this review, what I found really interesting about the review is they're very careful about what their baseline assumption is with this review. So if you notice the background assumption of the book is that sort of liberal capitalism is the best way of doing things. In fact, it's the only way that we know how to sort of organize society in any productive way. And so when you read through this book, what you get this idea is that what seems to be happening is that Trent and Catherine are basically trying to use encyclicals to defend, sort of liberal capitalist arrangements, right? And it's so interesting because that's essentially all there is in the book, right? There's a few critiques, there's some critiques of socialism, right? And that's all fine, I think. I mean, in general, their critiques of socialism are fairly well grounded. They could be better, I think, because instead of relying so much on libertarian economists, which they do very heavily, instead of relying on that, I understand that they have to rely on economics to an extent because you want to provide sort of a technical response to socialism, and so it's necessary to dig in here and say some things about, for instance, the knowledge problem, and all of that. But I think the challenge there is that the problem is that you're then making an assumption about the alternative, right? Then your assumption is then, okay, well, I guess that means we need a basically, laissez-faire market, right? A market that's not, that doesn't have very many controls on it by the state. And, okay, depending on where you're at on, what you think is necessary, sure. I mean, there is room for, disagreement about what controls the state can have. And they do admit that in the book. I mean, there's not much discussion of that. And there really is a lot because they lean so heavily on the liberal capitalist response to socialism. There really is not much room in what they're saying for, the government responding to problems. So to make this a little more concrete, one of the most telling parts of this in my mind, in terms of the economics, is their discussion of just wages. And so, when you read it, the impression you get is that there's, on the one hand, government directed wages. And then on the other hand, there's, essentially you get paid whatever, your employer wants to pay you. And those are your options, right? And in the case of the wage issue, it's very interesting because they explicitly then go into what some of the papal documents, want out of a just system. And it seems like, the authors of the book just simply cannot abide the requirements of the popes, because the popes are saying, look, you have to pay a living wage. If a man has a family, he should be able to provide for his family on the wage that he earns. So why do you think it's just for an employer to do anything but that? Right. And so, of course, then the objections start flying. Right. So it's interesting that if you read this carefully, you get the sense that, Horn and Pakaluk aren't as interested in the church's definition of, a just economic order as they are in using the church to justify liberal capitalism as it exists today. So there's some weird sleight of hand that goes in here. And, it's frustrating to say the least that, an outfit like Catholic Answers, which I really like, Tim Staples is fantastic. And I like Trent Horn's, atheism debates too, but it's shocking to me that they would print this because it just seems so obviously an attempt to, shield a certain worldview, that isn't, just the popes, right? So, the objections they give you to this just wage things are like, well, if some kid mows my lawn, what do I have to do? Like pay for a whole year's worth of, pay for his whole living, his living situation for a whole year? Well, no, of course not. Right. but this is where you get into discussions about what kind of institutions are best in society, right? Maybe cooperatives and local businesses are better than international megacorps, right? But of course, we can't criticize that because who funds the Bush School at Catholic University of America? You gotta keep your eye on the ball there when it comes to donors. So it's such an interesting kind of thing where we've let the sort of the state of things in the world modify how we are able to respond to what the church has told us is just, right? So to get around this idea that someone should be paid a just wage, right? Then we get into this whole discussion of it's the knowledge problem, right? The government can't calculate, but it's like Father Sirico says, the government's too stupid to calculate what the just wage is. And it's like, yeah, well, right, but that doesn't mean that there doesn't have to be any attempt whatsoever to, enforce this on employers. It doesn't mean that the employers themselves don't have a mandate, right? Just because it may be difficult for the government to enforce it doesn't mean that you don't have a moral obligation to do it as an employer. So, there's all these intermediate arguments that are, to me, so obvious, but yet don't get a hearing because, again, the purpose of the book seems to be to just excuse capitalism. So I want to go through a couple of quotes here. So they, of course, there's always going to be, citations of, especially John Paul II, his discussions of, capitalism and stuff like that, especially in Centesimus Annus. There's a specific passage that is just notorious for, if capitalism is just, businesses that are, constrained by law, well, then that's okay. And they just completely ignore the rest of the document, completely ignore the rest of, JP2's work on these types of things. So here's one example, and I didn't mention this, but Horn and Pakaluk, their discussion of the universal destination of goods is absolutely a joke. Literally, their definition is God gave the earth to all humanity. That's it. That's all that we're supposed to understand from the universal destination of goods. And they're even concerned that it might, quote unquote, be twisted to sound like socialism. Well, again, I think the problem is rather that Horn and Pakaluk don't understand what socialism is, and aren't very interested in knowing and in hearing what the universal destination of goods is, right? So, in contradiction to using JP2 to excuse liberal capitalism, let's read a little bit from Solicitudo Rei Socialis. I don't know if I read that right, or if I pronounce it right, but I'm doing my best. So here's what JP2 says. Number 42 from Solicitudo Rei Socialis. It is necessary to state once more the characteristic principle of Christian social doctrine. The goods of this world are originally meant for all. The right of private property is valid and necessary, but it does not nullify the value of this principle. Private property, in fact, is under a social mortgage, which means that it has an intrinsically social function based upon and justified precisely by the principle of the universal destination of goods. So there's a lot there. I mean, I found dozens of, theological articles on this concept of the social mortgage, right? I mean, there's a ton of information just in that one little paragraph. Well, why is none of that discussed, right? Why does this automatically have to mean socialism? Well, it does to Horn and Pakaluk because they don't understand what socialism is. They don't understand what the church requires of us when, in matters of economic, economic policy. And it seems as though the interest is in excusing capitalism, not in explaining why the church thinks socialism is bad, right? And I think that's one of the big problems here is the framing, is that, the framing of the book is socialism bad. And then because the framing is socialism bad, they can just sort of backdoor capitalism, therefore capitalism good, without explicitly saying that, because then it makes it hard for me to come in and critique them, because they're saying, hey, we're not saying capitalism is bad, we're just saying socialism is not good. And it's like, yeah, that's not what you're explicitly saying, but there's a lot of there's heavy implication in here. I want to address this family wage thing real quick. So in Laborum Execrans, or Execrans, I don't know how to say these things. JP2 kind of comes in and just absolutely slams a hammer down on this idea that, the just wages, just whatever the market will bear. It's not really a big deal. Even though the popes since the 1800s have, made it very clear that there is this concept of a just wage as a concrete moral imperative. Well, maybe not. Okay, well, here's JP2, number 19 in Laborum Execrans. Hence, in every case, a just wage is the concrete means of verifying the justice of the whole socioeconomic system, and in any case, of checking that it is functioning justly. It is not the only means of checking, but it is a particularly important one, and in a sense, the key means. So how is that unclear in any way about the just wage? I mean, this is the most important way to determine whether or not a socioeconomic system is just, like in general, right? The Benedictines say prayer and work, right? That's their motto. And, Christ told us, the worker deserves his wages. Obviously, this is incredibly important, especially in the world we live in today. So why, what is going on here? Why is there so much effort to play this down in a book that's supposed to be about socialism, right? Socialism has nothing to do with just wages. Socialism is unjust on its face. I don't understand this. This whole idea of trying to push down the importance of just wage. It's incredibly important. And yet that's what we get from Horn and Pakaluk's book. I want to end with one more quote from John Paul II from Centesimus Annus. So from number 42 in Centesimus Annus, quote, "Indeed, there is a risk that a radical capitalistic ideology could spread which refuses even to consider these problems in the a priori belief that any attempt to solve them is doomed to failure, and which blindly entrusts their solution to the free development of market forces," unquote. So you see there, right, we get a very important counteraction to the this idea that, because the technical economics tells us that, socialism doesn't work, well, then we can't have these, just wages. Nonsense. Utter nonsense. And really what's important here, the key distinction here is simply that the church certainly has within its authority and its competency to address the means of solving economic problems. The church is not restricted to talking only about the goals, right? The ends of the economic system. It is not restricted to talking only about the ethics of those things, about, what our goal is. The church certainly has a role in determining the justice of the means we use in economic policy. It cannot be, as John Paul II said, it cannot be left to whatever the market will bear. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.